I'd like to hear a little more about the relevance of how you bridge the gap between today's thinking and metaphysics and quantum physics.
Well, first of all, I never understood. Mrs. A called it Christian Science, and I never understood why we would assume that scientists only observe matter. And that I used to get asked, how can you be an astronomer or a physicist and a Christian scientist? And I studied light. Light doesn't weigh anything. It's not subject to time. It's got a lot of aspects to it. And this is just physics light, not even enlightenment in the sense. But Mrs. Eddy said suns and planets teach grand lessons. That implies, it says specifically that suns and planets are our teachers. So we have to learn from them. So how can you be a Christian Scientist and not be an astronomer? Okay. But I'm just saying that Mrs. Eddy was very scientific. And she said that through observation, invention, study, and original thought, mortal mind will outgrow itself. And we should not be surprised that's happening in the natural sciences. Robert Peel pointed out that general relativity and quantum physics had to be discovered before even the most rudimentary bridges could be thrown between the natural scientists and what Mrs. Eddy already wrote about consciousness, about matter, and so on, and reality, and substance. So those bridges are starting to happen. Mortal mind is outgrowing itself, and we should, it's time that Mrs. A took her place in the list of scientists. I mean, to me, she made the greatest discovery. What was her big discovery? In spite of all the material evidence, she discovered reality is perfect. It's like, wow, are you sure? It's like, well, watch this. Healing. It's like Jesus walked up to a man with a withered hand and he said, I have a withered hand. And Jesus said, no, you don't. Well, he healed with reality. And the guy looks down and he goes, I was wrong. So that is a scientific tendency. People say scientists just believe the evidence in the material senses. Really? The earth is flat then? Who discovered it was round? Well, the scientists. Okay. How about that the earth goes around the sun? That requires the evidence of intelligence to be thought more reliable than the evidence of the senses. You go, am I going to believe something that outrageous? I mean, a farmer 400 years ago is told that his farm is going around the sun at 18.5 miles a second. That must not have been easy. But through the evidence of intelligence, we've come to accept that the evidence of the material senses is not as reliable. And when we only accept the evidence of intelligence and none of the evidence of the material senses, we're practicing Christian Science. Mrs. Eddy said that she was writing a minister, and she said, to the effect, I didn't bring the exact quote, but she said that astronomy is not as difficult as Christian Science, only because astronomy expects you to give up some of the evidence of the senses, and Christian Science all of it. And then I thought, wow, I've been studying astronomy for 40 years or more, and Christian Science is only more difficult. It's like I try not to get discouraged. But then she said, I never know where to stop on this subject, which is great. So the science of Christianity is a science. It is the science. The difference is that we don't demonstrate God. God demonstrates us. And you cannot do Christian Science without God's direct involvement. Whereas you want to control everything, we need a control group. Well, we're the experiment. And we're the expression of God, not the other way around. So in Christian Science, you practice it as a science, but it's a little different than the usual, I've got control groups and stuff. You can't control the result. You let perfect mind control a result. It's often a surprise. The result of healing isn't a surprise, but how it comes about and the ideas that flow are sometimes really surprising. Long-winded answer, but there you go.
Well, they're never long-winded. Should we ask?
Thank you. I have a question about Christian Science and handling mental illness. Sometimes, it's sometimes easier to wrap our heads around physical healing, but mental healing seems a little less tangible, and I'm wondering if maybe you could expound a little bit on that.
Yeah, Mrs. Eddy says that the healing of insanity is easier than a lot of things. And I think it's because there was a woman that thought she was losing her thought, and my mom was in the part-time practice, and so she said, I think I'm losing my mind, and Mom said, good. The sooner you lose mortal mind and gain the divine mind, the better. And it's like that kind of calming, grounding feeling leads to a clarification of thought and healing of the body. So I think if you not just know, but just gently comprehend infinite mind is all and fills all space, just contemplate that, then thoughts will be right. You'll have the right thoughts, and that'll be healing. The idea of individual minds is wrong altogether. The sun doesn't send out suns, Mrs. A says, it sends out light. But every light has all the qualities. If you take a spectrum of this ray of light, it has calcium and hydrogen and all the stuff of the sun. So each one has everything. And so there's this completeness. You have every quality that God expresses in your unique way. And I think so, in that sense, healing of the idea that you are your own mind is important. We all need to be healed from that notion. Like the earth's in the center, but it also was the lowest. Hell was below us, but the angels were up there. So the earth in the center wasn't working. And when Copernicus, and followed up by Kepler and those guys, found that the sun was in the center, a pope said, well, if the earth's in heaven, what's the need for salvation? But we had to deprovincialize our thinking about things. And Mrs. A talks about us, in this age, giving up this idea of a self-centered consciousness. She says we are ideas in orbit around the infinite mind. And so look what happened in the last 400 years by just deprovincializing where the earth is. Instead of the center, we got to be participants in the whole universe. And the same thing with consciousness. Instead of being self-centered with our own consciousness, we can be ideas in the orbit of infinite mind and participate on a universal scale. So I think it's important to outgrow the notion that we have our own mind that can come and go and die and live and all this sort of thing. In quantum physics, you can do experiments to show that particles called electrons don't exist until they're measured, and it seems that measurement requires some kind of conscious involvement. Well, how can electrons in the brain synapses create consciousness when it's provable by quantum physics that electrons don't exist without consciousness first, observing them? So even according to natural science, you don't think with the brain. I know it's really insistent. People insist on that, but materialism, this Victorian science. I had a biologist, he wrote into National Geographic, and he mentioned Christian Science, and COP asked me to reply. And I just replied that if you're working on the biological scale, you can afford the approximation that matter exists. If you were working on the quantum physics scale, you cannot afford that approximation. If you're a taxi driver, you can assume the earth is flat from driving from here to San Diego. But if you're an airline pilot, you cannot afford that assumption. The earth has to be round. And so it's the same thing. This objective matter is an approximation in natural science. But quantum physicists and other people that read about quantum physics know it isn't. So another thing to do is get a sense of the nothingness of matter. That's another healing thing. The main thing is, though, there's only one mind. There was a guy at MIT, I was giving a talk at the engineering department at MIT, a Christian Science talk. And this guy in the back who's an engineering major said, I meditate and I feel better. But when I meditate on the idea of infinite mind or God, I feel the best. I said, why is that? Why do you think that works better? And he went, bing. Wow, maybe because it's truer. I'm going, yeah. So this idea of infinite mind will kick in when you go there, and it will start to flow, and it will have healing. And once more, Mrs. A says it's easier. It's even easier to heal mental than physical, in that sense.